Hello, everybody. This is Jeffrey Williams, and welcome to Too Late for the Gods. Randal Rauser recently did a YouTube debate with David C Smalley on the question, is it rational to believe in Christianity, which is linked below. Smalley soundly demolished every one of Rauser's arguments, so I won't go into the debate itself. Instead, I will once again address the Reformed epistemology, which forms the basis for Rauser's arguments, which was not directly addressed in the debate. A bit of background: while I am very much an atheist, I don't think of myself primarily defined by that. My interest is philosophy, particularly post-Heideggerian ontology, and I advocate against metaphysics of every sort, which of course includes any notion of gods. Let's begin with a quick review of Reformed epistemology, which forms the basis of Rauser's argumentation, before listening to Rauser's opening argument. I went over this in detail in an earlier video, but to summarize, Reformed epistemology was the creation of apologists, with Alvin Plantinga being the most prominent, and it is used by most apologists, such as William Lane Craig. What it does is it attempts to weaken the more robust foundationalist epistemology, and it does this out of frustration with the impossibility of justifying a belief in God within the foundationalist framework. Foundationalist epistemology asserts that it is possible to avoid the infinite regression in justifying a premise by defining criteria for what it calls properly basic beliefs. Properly basic beliefs can legitimately be accepted as a starting premise, and thereby halting the infinite regressive justification for the premise, if they satisfy one of the following three conditions. 1, evident to the senses. 2, incorrigible. Or 3, self-evident. What this means is, to be a valid opening premise, the claim must either be objectively available to experience, or a condition of thought itself, such as 1 + 1 = 2. Since a God cannot be given through objective experience, nor is it a condition of thought, since we can quite easily think atheistically, no valid proof of God is possible. The intent of foundationalist epistemology is to avoid what Kant called transcendental illusion, or empty metaphysical speculation, which was common prior to the Enlightenment and persists today in theological speculation, but rather the attempt is to ground argumentation in the reality of the physical world. It is putting into practice the idea that concepts are empty without sense data. The theist's insurmountable obstacle was this: 1, belief in God requires the right kind of evidence in order to be rational. No such evidence exists for belief in God, therefore belief in God is not rational. The strategy behind Reformed epistemology was to weaken the standards for properly basic beliefs, as well as the meaning of rational, in order to change the second premise to such evidence does exist. This attempt included several elements. The first is contextualization, which states that within specific cultures or groups, beliefs are passed down through the generations, and it is reasonable to assume the truth of these traditions within the context of that culture. The move made here is to emphasize reasonability instead of reason itself. Within any given culture, a belief may in fact not be true, but within the culture, the claim is that it is reasonable to believe it. Reasonability requires no actual reasoned syllogism, but is used to simply justify a belief as properly basic, absent evidence of the senses, being incorrigible, or being self-evident. Second is the acceptability of testimony as properly basic. Instead of requiring claims to be directly available to the senses, the claim is we can simply take someone's word for it if the person seems credible, such as Paul's claim of 500 witnesses to the resurrection. Third is an assertion of an innate special sense beyond the 5 known senses, which Plantinga calls sensus divinitatis, a term he borrows from Calvin. This sense is said to exist as experience of God's presence and is as valid as any other objective observation. This is intended to satisfy the requirement of available to the senses, although there is no evidence at all for such a sixth sense. Fourth is an attempt to discredit the notion of objective reality by arguing that classical foundationalism is itself self-referentially incoherent. That is, classical foundationalism itself is not self-evident, incorrigible, or evident to the senses. Adherents often raise the case of theory of mind, in which they claim we cannot assume that minds outside our own exist within the foundationalist framework. These claims are highly questionable and involve a much larger conversation for another time, but the objective here is to claim that knowledge reliant on direct experience and condition of thought is really no more reliable than cultural beliefs and testimony. This approach, however, comes with a cost. It forces apologists to concede that the arguments for God cannot be proofs, and settles for the claim that they can, however, be reasonable. This detaches reasoned argument from the enterprise of establishing truth and reduces it to mere reasonability. This is a major retreat from the claim of proof of God and lowers its aim to an appeal to at least be taken seriously. Along with this is the implication that nothing really can be proven true anyway, so our reasonability in in belief in God is as valid as any other approach. Plantinga therefore puts a universal if in front of the apologists' premises, rendering them logically true, therefore reasonable given the premise. Yet there remains a strain of insistence that their truth somehow is the correct version, especially when compared to other religions or to atheism. Now let's take a look at Rauser's opening statement.
So the question of the debate is this: is belief in the Christian God rational? I mean, that's the way that this question was presented to me. But of course, if the Christian description of God is true, then Christianity is true, and thus to ask whether the Christian God is rational as an object of belief just is to ask whether Christianity is rational. So I am going to proceed on the assumption that the essence of debate concerns whether Christian belief can be rational. And in this debate, I will argue, yeah, indeed, Christian belief can be rational. Now, I'm going to define Christianity as a religion that consists of a particular set of doctrines, including the Trinity, fall, Israel covenant, incarnation, atonement, resurrection, second coming, Bible as a medium of special revelation. In short, what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity. Notably, mere Christianity does not include any specific interpretation of any of those doctrines. So beware of attempts to argue for the irrationality of Christianity based on the alleged irrationality of some subset of Christian opinion. For example, in the same way that one does not establish the irrationality of philosophical naturalism simplicator by attacking the rationality of some specific interpretation of philosophical naturalism, such as reductive materialism, so one does not establish the irrationality of mere Christianity by attacking the irrationality of some specific version of Christianity, such as North American Protestant fundamentalism. Next, how do we define rationality? Well, for the purposes of this debate, I'll define rationality in terms of a classic virtue. A virtue is a disposition to behave rightly and is contrasted with a vice, which is a disposition to behave wrongly. In Aristotle's account, A virtue is a golden mean, a disposition balanced between two extremes, the vice of deficiency and the vice of excess. For example, in between the vice of cowardice, a deficiency, and the vice of foolhardiness, an excess, one finds the virtue of courage. In between the vice of stinginess, a deficiency, and the vice of extravagance, an excess, stands the virtue of generosity. When it comes to the regulation of belief and proper belief formation, we find that rationality stands in between the vice of extreme unwarranted skepticism, a deficiency, and the vice of extreme credulity, an excess. In other words, rationality is the virtue of having cognitive capacities properly formed so that one believes when it is appropriate to do so and abstains from belief when it is appropriate to do so, thereby avoiding the irrationality of either excess skepticism or credulity. Importantly, rationality encompasses not simply proper beliefs as an output, but also the proper reasoning processes by which that belief is formed. It involves the articulation of the logical relationship between various truth claims, the valid movement from premises to conclusion, the assessment of intrinsic and contextualized probability and plausibility, and an awareness of one's own cognitive biases and an attempt to redress them.
The first thing we see is Rauser's attempt to redefine reasoned argument away from the search for truth according to data and logic to the merely reasonable, a golden middle seen as reasonable because it rejects both extremes. It is now a character trait, indeed a virtue, rather than an epistemological tool to discover hard reality. Truth is tacitly removed as the objective. Next, he asserts the primacy of valid logic as the proper relationship between truth claims. Therefore, something can be reasonable regardless of the validity of the premises if it follows proper logical form. Again, the turn from truth to mere reasonability as adherence to formal logic. That is no less than the reinstatement of the metaphysical transcendental illusion that had been overcome post-Kant.
Keep in mind as well that an ascription of virtue is to some degree contextualized. To illustrate, if Mike Tyson insults a man's girlfriend, is it virtuous for that man to ask Tyson to step outside? Well, that depends on who the man is. It would be foolhardy for P.B. Herman to ask Tyson to step outside, but it could indeed be courageous for a Golden Glove boxing champion to do so. My apologies for my dated cultural references, by the way. Thus, the same action can be foolhardy or courageous depending on who undertakes the action. Rationality is the same. Whether a particular belief is rational is typically context dependent, as such judgments are made relative to specific individuals in particular contexts relative to their current beliefs and experiences. For example, if a man standing on a street corner advises Smith that a new drug will protect him against rational for Smith to believe him. Well, that depends. If Smith recognizes the man as Dr. Anthony Fauci, then it may indeed be rational for him to believe it. Whereas if Smith does not recognize the man, it would be probably irrational for him to believe it. So the rationality of Smith's assent is relative to his background beliefs, such that as the belief that the man is a respected infectious disease specialist.
Here he moves to contextuality, which is the claim that under certain circumstances, a miracle can be more probable than natural explanations. These circumstances, however, typically involve unsupported testimony and tradition rather than real evidence. He further offers an example of contextualization in terms of personal character, in this case, foolhardiness or bravery, but none of that goes to the truth of an actual claim of existence, such as the existence of a God. An ontological determination is never a matter of character, which is why it never rests on testimony alone, but only testimony supported by physical evidence. Rauser evades that requirement by substituting the assumed trustworthiness of the witness, ignoring the manifold problems inherent in that trust, including possible bias, misperception, error, or lack of original source for the witnesses, in other words, mere hearsay.
When a person claims that all expressions of a complex and diverse belief system or worldview are irrational, they have a high burden of proof to demonstrate that there is no possibility for that belief system to be assented to rationally, ranging across all the diverse sets of beliefs and experiences by adherents of that belief system or worldview. For example, some theists claim that all atheists are irrational. While there certainly may be irrational atheists, to make the claim that atheism is always irrational, such that all 250 million atheists globally are irrational, irrespective of their background beliefs and experiences, well, that assumes a very high evidential burden. In like manner, some atheists argue that all Christians are irrational. While there certainly may be instances where Christians are irrational, to make the claim it is always irrational, such that all 2.3 billion plus Christians globally are irrational, again, irrespective of background belief and experience, well, that too assumes a very high evidential burden. The more than 2 billion Christians on planet Earth form their beliefs under a dizzyingly diverse range of circumstances: testimony, reasoned argument, experience, and so on. What is the basis to believe that Christian belief formation is always irrational, ranging across all of these circumstances?
Here, Rauser conflates a rational belief with the rationality of an individual, thereby again evading the necessity to justify rationality of any one belief. The implication is that if you call a theist belief irrational, you then call the individual irrational, a violation of the agreement to be reasonable as a virtuous character trait. The reality is quite different, however. Everyone holds irrational and rational beliefs. The whole point of epistemology is to distinguish between them.
At this point, it would be helpful to focus, I think, on a specific example. So let's consider two cases of belief formation by way of parental testimony. We'll begin with atheist Richard Dawkins, who recalls in one of his essays, "I was driving through the English countryside with my daughter, Juliet, then aged 6, and she pointed out some flowers on the wayside. I asked her what she thought wildflowers were for. She gave a rather thoughtful answer. 2 things, she said, to make the world pretty and to help the bees make honey for us. I was touched by this, and sorry I had to tell her it wasn't true." Now, Dawkins is teaching Juliet a dysteleological view of nature, a view that is consistent with naturalism and atheism, but not with various other views, including Christian theism. Well, was Juliet rational to believe her father's testimony? As noted above, one is indeed rational to accept the testimony of another person, and certainly a trusted parental authority, unless one has overriding reason not to. In fact, philosophers call this the principle of testimony. So the onus would be on the critic to provide good reasons why Juliet could not be rational to accept the testimony of her father as to the dysteleology of nature. Unless and until those good reasons are provided, we should conclude that Juliet is rational. Well, now let's come to our second scenario. Rather than Dawkins and Juliet in the countryside, our countryside is now being visited by renowned British theoretical physicist and Anglican priest John Polkinghorne and his daughter, Isabel. Isabel also says the flowers are to make the world pretty and to help the bees make honey for us. And Polkinghorne, a Christian who accepts teleology in nature, says, "Yes, Isabel, God made the flowers to make the world pretty and give him praise." And with that, they continue on their way as Polkinghorne then begins to describe to her the mysteries of Schrodinger's cat. Just as Juliet was rational to accept her father's testimony as to the dysteleology of nature, so Isabel was rational to accept her father's testimony as to the divinely given teleology of nature. So the onus is on the critic, in this case David, to provide good reasons why Isabel and her famous father could not be rational in precisely the same way as Juliet and her father.
Here we have the silliest of all of Rauser's arguments. First, notice how he infantilizes reason. One of the most important differences between an adult and a child is the ability to reason, which isn't fully formed until somewhere in our mid-20s. That's why we don't consider children competent until they reach the age of majority. The idea that the child in either example is making a rational determination is ridiculous. but rather the child is internalizing the belief of a trusted parent. Yet this is the paradigm on which Reformed epistemology attempts to legitimize the transmission of cultural and religious beliefs as properly basic. On this principle, it would be properly basic for the children of Jim Jones' cult to believe that their suicide is going to be appropriate. Perhaps the more important formulation is that the Jones cult members failed to exercise adult reason and childishly internalize the ranting of a trusted authority figure. But this is the model that Rauser espouses.
The rationality of accepting parental testimony is but one of the initial steps in the rationality of Christianity. As a Christian, I personally have devoted careful attention to proper reasoning processes in support of my beliefs. I have a PhD in systematic theology from a leading British research university. I've defended my views in many debates, such as this one. I've also participated in devil's advocate debates in which I defend atheism because the ability to defend the views of one's interlocutor is a hallmark of rationality and intellectual virtue. And I've published several books defending my beliefs, most recently, Conversations with My Inner Atheist. It would be a downer if, after all these efforts, I have not even succeeded in meeting the minimal bar of basic rationality. But I believe I have provided excellent reasons to believe that I, and countless Christians like me, can at least meet the minimal threshold of being rational. To conclude, I've argued that rationality is the mean between excessive skepticism and excessive credulity. We are rational to accept the deliverances of the complex doxastic processes by which we naturally form beliefs, sense perception, rational intuition, testimony, memory, etc., unless we have a good reason to doubt them. This includes both those who acquire beliefs consistent with views such as atheism, as in the case of Dawkins and Juliet, as well as views such as Christianity, as in the case of Polkinghorne and Isabel. Unless and until a person can provide a powerful argument that all 250 million atheists are irrational, one should conclude that many of them are indeed rational. Likewise, unless and until a person can provide a powerful argument that all 2.3 billion plus Christians are irrational, one should conclude that many of them likewise are rational.
He concludes with an appeal to his claimed activities of rationally considering the question of Christianity and writing various books on the subject. This claim, however, does not substitute for an actual evidence-based argument for Christianity, which he cannot provide. He then repeats his appeal to the virtue of moderation in accepting his meeting the bar of reasonableness, which of course he fails to meet. Then again proclaims the legitimacy of admitting the results of what he terms the natural doxastic processes by which we naturally form beliefs, which are fancy words for contextualization, which itself is a fancy word for accepting what your parents and culture tell you, unless we have a good reason to doubt them. That's an interesting qualification, unless we have good reason to doubt them, because the core objective of Reformed epistemology is to delegitimize all the reasons to doubt, thereby making it impossible to argue against Christianity. Of course, we do have very good reason to doubt on the basis of the weakness of testimony, lack of objective evidence, the physical impossibility of miracles, and the utter unreliability and danger of madness by simply accepting the result of doxastic practices. In short, Reformed epistemology is not a legitimate branch of philosophy, but rather just another apologist's rhetorical trick, nostalgic for the lost days of medieval metaphysics.